As chief speechwriter to Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama, our next speaker has known the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. That it inspired the speech of another First Lady 8 years later. Her story is all about finding your own voice. Please welcome to the stage, Sarah Hurwitz.
Boss, Michelle Obama, her so heavy, getting no $1. Boss, Michelle Obama, her so heavy, getting no $1. Boss, Michelle Obama, her so heavy, getting no $1.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kathy, Mary, Ad Club. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be here. And to my fellow speakers, you guys are awesome. And I'm really glad that everyone is being so honest, because it always baffles me when people who've achieved some measure of success try to present their careers as a linear series of well-thought-out steps, each achieving yet another milestone in their meticulously plotted long-term plan. I honestly have no idea what they are talking about. I've never had a long-term plan, and I often haven't had a short-term plan either. And that, my friends, is the reality of a career in politics. Whether you have a job in a week can depend on whether it rains on election day, or whether a foreign government hacks your emails, just hypothetically, or whether you happen to know someone who makes the call and puts in a good word. But I also know that my story doesn't begin with me. It stretches back for generations. And the farthest I can reliably trace it is to my great-grandmother. She was a Jewish immigrant from Lithuania who lived with her husband in a tenement on the Lower East Side of New York City. And one of her 4 daughters, Kate Hurwitz, was my grandmother. And if you're wondering how a Jewish girl born in 1912 got the name Kate, the answer is that there was an Irish lady down the hall who was incredibly kind to her family. She helped them get settled, she helped them learn English, and when my grandmother was born, my great-grandmother declared, "We are naming her Kate." To which I imagine my great-grandfather replied, "Another girl? Name her whatever you want." Now, my great-grandmother was thrilled to be living in New York City because she desperately wanted her daughters to go to college, and New York had the city college system that was both affordable and open to Jews. But much to her disappointment, her husband moved the family to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and that's where my grandmother Kate grew up. And she was a total firecracker. She was a star high school debater, she was a passionate Roosevelt Democrat, and she dreamed of going to law school and going into politics. But she never got that chance. Instead, she got a job at a coal company during the Great Depression, where she had the audacity to insist that the owner give coal to families even if they couldn't pay, because she couldn't bear the thought of anyone freezing. She got married, she had 3 sons, and she was widowed in her mid-40s. To support her family, she got a real estate broker's license. She bought and rented out an entire apartment building, and she played the stock market, and eventually saved enough money to send my father and his 2 brothers to college and graduate school. Now, I inherited her passion for public service, and I had parents who encouraged that passion and who loved and supported me unconditionally. And because of them, I got my start in politics by interning in the White House in the summer of 1998. Now, I was placed in Vice President Gore's scheduling and advance office, where I spent my time making rental car reservations and listening to my fellow intern, a guy named Len, talk about his sex life in vivid detail. This was entertaining, but not really what I had in mind for my summer in the White House. And then one day, I crashed a going-away party for one of Vice President Gore's staffers. And there, I met a guy who happened to be one of Gore's speechwriters. And I was desperate to escape the long calls with Hurwitz and the semi-pornographic conversations with Len. So I basically begged this guy to let me be his intern. Now, he agreed, and I had a wonderful summer working for him and his colleagues, and they helped me get my first job after college, which was in state government in Maryland. In that job, I commuted 3 hours a day round trip, sat in a windowless cubicle next to the bathroom, and was completely miserable. I lasted 9 months. I then got my second job as a speechwriter for a wonderful US Senator from Iowa named Tom Harkin. in which I quickly realized that I knew nothing about speechwriting. And while I did my best to fudge my way through it, in my first performance review, Harkin's chief of staff said to me, "So, I hear you're thinking about law school. You should definitely do that, like really soon, ideally this year." So I took the hint, and I headed off to Harvard Law School, vowing that I would become a lawyer and never write speeches again, since I clearly had no talent for it. Then in about the third week of class, I met one of my classmates, a guy named Josh, who had previously been a speechwriter for President Clinton. And he convinced me to join him in doing some freelance speechwriting. And over the next couple of years, as we worked together, Josh taught me how to actually write a speech, how to structure it, how to write to be heard rather than to be read. And then one day, in September of our third year of law school, Josh calls me to tell me that he has a new client for us. It was a Democratic primary candidate named General Wesley Clark. The thing is, it wasn't just a freelance job, it was more like kind of a full-time campaign job. Now, this campaign was in Little Rock, Arkansas, and our law school was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And up until this point, I had basically never skipped a class in my life. So I told Josh that he was insane, and that while I'd come to Arkansas for a couple days to help out, there was no way I was doing this. Well, a couple days turned into a couple weeks, which turned into a semester of back and forth between Little Rock and Cambridge, probably more forth than back, and ultimately Clark lost. Then we finished law school. Josh got a job on Kerry's presidential campaign, 2004, and he brought me with him, and Kerry lost. I then decided that it was probably time to execute on my plan to be a lawyer, and I worked at a wonderful law firm with people I absolutely adored. But after over 4,000 billable hours spent deep in the weeds of companies' legal problems, it was clear to me that the law was not my calling. And fortunately, that was right about when I got a call from none other than my old friend Josh, who told me, "Sarah, Hillary Clinton is running for president, and she's looking for a chief speechwriter, and you should apply." To which I replied, "Are you kidding? There is no way I'm qualified for that job." Which is funny, because I had already been deputy chief speechwriter for not one, but two presidential campaigns. But still, I didn't feel qualified. Talk about her story. So a month later, Josh called again and told me they were still looking. Again, I said no. Who was I to write for this amazing woman who'd been my hero since I was a kid? Finally, a month after that, Josh calls again and says, "Okay, I think they might be cool with the idea of co-chief speechwriters. You could do the job with someone else. How about that?" Now that sounded reasonable. So I applied and interviewed, and then Josh called to tell me that I'd gotten the job, but they only wanted one chief speechwriter. Yeah. By then, it was too late to back out, so I took the job, which I held for 17 months until, of course, she lost. You'll notice a pattern here. A few days after Hillary's concession speech, I got a call from a guy named John Favreau, with whom I had worked on the Kerry campaign. He was then Senator Obama's chief speechwriter and is a singularly wonderful guy. And after congratulating me on a hard-fought race, he gingerly asked whether I might maybe be willing to come work for him as a speechwriter for Obama. Now, I happily said yes. While I loved Hillary and I was incredibly proud to have worked for her, I also deeply admired and respected Senator Obama. So I headed to Chicago, started writing for him, and a few weeks into this new gig, John takes me aside and says, "So we kind of need someone to write Michelle's Democratic Convention speech, and people want you to do it." Now, it seems crazy to remember now, but I was pretty annoyed. I mean, I was there to write for the candidate, not his wife, and I let John know that. John was sympathetic, but unmoved. And thank goodness for that. Because in the course of working on that speech, I came to know a brilliant, wise, funny, caring woman, someone who eventually became my speechwriting soulmate. Someone who, even though I had just spent 17 months attacking her husband on a rival campaign, welcomed me like an old friend, as did her husband himself, which I think tells you a lot about the kind of people the Obamas are. Anyway, Barack Obama won that election, which was obviously a very new experience for me to win one of these things. And I had the pleasure of going with him to the White House, where I wrote speeches for him and eventually became chief speechwriter for Mrs. Obama. And man, that was an awesome job. Week after week, I got to sit down with Michelle Obama and ask her, what do you want to say in this speech? And then sit back and type as fast as I could as she laid out brilliant, edgy ideas and full paragraphs of moving, vivid language. Michelle Obama knows who she is. She always knows what she wants to say. And I was very lucky to be along for the ride. For 8 years, I got to travel with her and the president across the country and around the world in this big blue and white plane with United States of America stamped on its side. I got to ride in motorcades on 5 continents where people would line the streets waving American flags. I got to meet extraordinary people, kids who grew up surrounded by gangs and drugs who got themselves to college. I met veterans and military families who made extraordinary sacrifices for our country. I met girls across the globe who would walk for hours each day, risking kidnapping and assault just to get to a classroom. And then they would walk back and study for hours each night by candlelight. I got to help Mrs. Obama write a historic speech at the 2016 Democratic National Convention, and obviously at the Republican one too. And I also got to work on the speech where she so passionately spoke about the appalling misogyny that we saw in this last election. And I'll tell you, in the weeks after the speech, I got to read some of the many letters she got from women of all ages, saying things like, "You made me realize that I no longer need to be ashamed about what happened to me." And from men saying, "Thank you for giving voice to the disgust that so many decent guys are feeling right now." Now, was this job stressful and exhausting? It was. When you know that every word you write is going to be scrutinized by people across the globe, that can sometimes keep you up at night. Were there some near misses? There were. I'm actually still haunted by a speech that Mrs. Obama gave in Japan, where she was announcing a new partnership with the Japanese government to promote girls' education in developing countries. Now, I wanted to find a nice Japanese proverb to end the speech. And after days of searching, I finally found one that went as follows. "No road is long with a good companion." It was perfect. The challenge of educating girls would be hard, but it would be doable with our wonderful companion, the government of Japan. So I sent it off to the staff at our embassy in Japan, just as an FYI. And a few hours later, I got a call from one of the local staff, a Japanese woman who was employed by our embassy to help with translation. And she said to me, "So I know this sounds like it's a nice proverb about friendship, but actually it's a proverb about suicide." Who knew? Needless to say, I cut it from the speech. But amidst the stress, my family's story really grounded me. It helped remind me that at every moment of my life, I am where I am because of advantages that I did not earn, advantages that my grandmother and great-grandmother never had. And while I could probably tell my story as if it were all linear and planned out, how each speechwriting job prepared me for the next one, how I kept making more connections, each of which helped me get my next gig, that's not how I see it. I see my career as consisting of 1 crashed party, 2 failed jobs, 3 losing campaigns, a lot of missed law school classes, and several instances when, because of my own doubt or risk aversion or short-sightedness, I came very close to turning down life-changing opportunities. I mean, guys, I got some of my most important jobs in politics because I met a guy named Josh my first year of law school. And it is hard to think that you are so amazing when you realize that you are where you are not just because of your own talent and hard work, but because of so many fortunate accidents and moments of grace and acts of kindness and support from others. But my family's story doesn't just ground me, it also very much informs my writing. People often ask me, how did you get Mrs. Obama's voice? And I actually think they're being polite when they ask this. I think that what they really want to ask is, how did you, a white Jewish girl who's the daughter of a corporate lawyer from a Boston suburb, capture the voice of an African-American woman from a working-class family on the south side of Chicago? And they're right, that Mrs. Obama and I have very different stories and life experiences. But when she talks about how in her family, education was like a religion, how her parents didn't have college degrees but were absolutely determined to send her and her brother to college because they knew that education was the key to success, I hear my own family's values. That's what my brother and I were taught by our parents. When she talks about her father who had multiple sclerosis and how as he got sicker, he had to wake up earlier because it took him longer to button his uniform and drag himself across their apartment using 2 canes, but he still hardly ever missed a day of work, I think about my grandmother. I think about how she would pore over Barron's and Forbes magazines late into the night to learn more about the stock market. And then she would wake up the next morning to get down on her hands and knees and scrub the floors of those apartments she rented out because she couldn't afford to hire cleaners. Mrs. Obama's father and my grandmother believed the exact same thing, that you are entitled to nothing, that you have to work for everything you have, and that you do whatever it takes to provide for your family. And finally, I think about how in her convention speech last year, Mrs. Obama talked about all those before her who, and I quote, felt the lash of bondage, the shame of servitude, the sting of segregation, but who kept on striving and hoping and doing what needed to be done so that today I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. Now, my family's experience in this country is very, very different from her family's experience. But there is a similar thread of yearning and sacrifice for the next generation that runs through both our stories. My grandmother never got to realize her dreams of being a lawyer and going into politics. But today, I have a degree from Harvard Law School, and every day for the past 8 years, I walked through the gates of the White House to get to work. My great-grandmother never realized her dreams of sending her daughters to college. But believe it or not, the last commencement speech that Mrs. Obama gave was at none other than the City College of New York. And 3 generations later, I rolled up to that school in a motorcade with the First Lady of the United States of America. And today, I am the proud aunt of a 1-month-old baby niece whose name is Catherine. She's named after her great-grandmother, who was named after a kind Irish lady, a fellow striving immigrant to this country who helped her family more than a century ago. This is not a Jewish story or an African-American story. This is an American story. It is the very story told by President John Adams when he said, and I quote, "I must study politics and war, that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, commerce, in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music." This is what we mean when we talk about the American dream, that with hard work, we can do well for ourselves and leave something even better for our kids. And it worries me that this American ideal is under siege as we see rising inequality and declining social mobility, and stories like mine are becoming more and more difficult to achieve. It also worries and frightens me that the response we're seeing to this is not a call to common purpose, not reassurance that we're all into this together, and surely we can figure it out. Instead, we're being told that this is a zero-sum game and that others are getting what is rightly ours. We're hearing calls to view entire groups of people as criminals or as terrorists or as bad hombres, the kind of stereotyping, scapegoating, and dehumanizing of other people that as a Jew who knows some history sends chills down my spine. And while what I'm saying might be kind of political, it certainly is not partisan. For as long as I can remember, presidents of both parties have generally tried to call us to our highest American values. I think President George W. Bush's first inaugural address is a good example. Now, I'm a lifelong Democrat, and I disagree with him on most policy issues. But when he said, and I quote, "Every immigrant, by embracing our ideals, makes our country more, not less American," and "Civility is not a tactic or a sentiment, it is the determined choice of trust over cynicism, of community over chaos. And I ask you to be citizens. Citizens, not spectators. Citizens, not subjects." In those words, I hear a call to our highest values. And I worry that today we're hearing a very different call. A call to fear, a call to blame, a call to anger, a call to obedience. And just to state the obvious, those are not and never will be American values. I worry that we're being called to be afraid of and to distrust the very things that make us who we are. Our diversity, our compassion, our leadership in the world, our rule of law, our vibrant free press. Now, I went into politics because I passionately believe in those values and those institutions. And I went into speechwriting because I wanted to tell the stories of people who breathe life into them every day, people whose stories often go untold, people like Michelle Obama's father and like my grandmother. But it's not just people in politics who have an obligation to tell those stories. And that's really part of the reason why I wanted to be here today. Because I think that you all are some of our most important storytellers. I mean, that's what your ads do. They tell stories. They can tell the stories of our history and remind us where we came from, like that wonderful ad that Budweiser aired at the Super Bowl about our heritage as a nation of immigrants. They can tell the stories of our shared humanity that remind us of who we are. I'm thinking of the beautiful Amazon ad featuring an imam and a priest who are friends and who buy each other knee pads, each realizing that the other could use them as he kneels down to pray. The simple message of these ads, the reminder that we have the power to transcend our differences and to see ourselves in each other, that does not belong to any political party. And it should speak to people no matter who they voted for. And frankly, the fact that these ads were at all controversial is a sign of just how desperately their message is needed right now. I personally think my former boss really put it best when she said, "When they go low, we go high." And for the record, that was her line entirely. She came up with it. My only contribution was to type it into the speech. But in the days ahead, I hope that we can all find ways to heed those words and to keep telling our very best American story. Thank you.